Karen Mitchell had always believed the world owed her something special. At 42 years old, she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting her way through sheer volume and persistence. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled, her nails freshly manicured, and her voice could cut through any crowd when she felt wronged. On this particular Tuesday morning in London, Karen was already having what she considered a terrible day. The hotel breakfast had run out of her preferred sugar-free options. The taxi driver had taken what she deemed the wrong route to Buckingham Palace, despite his 20 years of experience navigating London streets. And now, as she stood among the crowd of tourists gathered to watch the changing of the guard ceremony, someone had bumped into her designer handbag. "Excuse me," she snapped at an elderly gentleman who had accidentally brushed against her while trying to get a better view. Some people have no manners whatsoever. The man apologized quietly and stepped aside, but Karen wasn't finished. She turned to her husband, Gerald, who had learned over their 15 years of marriage to simply nod and agree when Karen was in one of her moods. "I paid good money for this tour, Gerald," she declared loudly enough for several nearby tourists to hear. "The least these people could do is show some respect for personal space." Gerald, a mild-mannered accountant from Ohio, adjusted his glasses nervously. "Maybe we could move to a different spot, honey," he suggested gently. "Absolutely not," Karen huffed. "I was here first, and I have every right to stand exactly where I want to stand." The crowd around them began to grow thicker as the ceremony time approached. Families with children squeezed in beside them. Excited teenagers held up their phones to record everything, and elderly couples leaned on each other to get better views. Karen's frustration mounted with each new arrival. When a young mother with a toddler in a stroller positioned herself nearby, Karen's patience finally snapped. "This is ridiculous," she announced to no one in particular. "There are too many people here. Someone needs to do something about this crowd control." The ceremony began with the familiar sound of military drums echoing across the palace grounds. The crowd fell into an appreciative hush as the guards began their precise, choreographed movements. For most visitors, this was a magical moment, a chance to witness centuries of British tradition firsthand. But Karen wasn't most visitors. She found herself growing increasingly annoyed by every small inconvenience. A child behind her was asking his mother questions about the guards. A group of Japanese tourists were quietly translating for each other. An elderly woman near her was pointing out details to her granddaughter. "Gerald," Karen whispered harshly, "I can barely see anything with all these people talking." The truth was, Karen had an excellent view of the ceremony. She was positioned in the front section of the crowd, with an unobstructed line of sight to the guards, but her mood had soured so completely that she couldn't appreciate what was unfolding before her. As the guards continued their ceremony, Karen noticed one particular guard who was stationed directly in her line of vision. He was tall and imposing, wearing the traditional red tunic and tall black hat. His face was stoic and professional, eyes fixed straight ahead as he maintained his position with military precision. "Look at him," Karen muttered to Gerald, gesturing toward the guard, "just standing there like a statue. What's so special about that? Anyone could do that job." Gerald tried to shush his wife, but Karen was just getting started. She had found her target for the day's frustrations, and the young guard had no idea what was coming his way. "I bet he thinks he's so important," she continued, her voice growing louder, "standing there in that ridiculous hat, pretending to be so serious. It's just a show for tourists." Several people around her began to take notice of Karen's commentary. Some shot her disapproving looks, while others simply tried to ignore her and focus on the ceremony. But Karen was beyond caring about social norms or appropriate behavior. She reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a pack of chewing gum, the expensive imported kind she always carried. As she unwrapped a piece and popped it into her mouth, an idea began to form in her mind. It was the kind of idea that would have horrified her if she had been thinking clearly, but Karen's judgment had been clouded by her mounting frustration and sense of entitlement. "You know what, Gerald?" she said, chewing loudly. "I think it's time someone showed these guards that they're not as untouchable as they pretend to be." Gerald looked at his wife with growing concern. He had seen that expression before, the narrow-eyed look of determination that usually preceded one of Karen's most embarrassing public outbursts. "Karen, please," he whispered urgently. "Let's just enjoy the ceremony." But Karen had already made up her mind. She continued chewing her gum methodically, working it into the perfect consistency for what she was planning. The guard stood motionless, completely unaware that he was about to become the target of one of the most foolish decisions Karen Mitchell had ever made. The crowd continued to watch the ceremony with respectful attention, completely oblivious to the brewing storm that was about to erupt from the well-dressed American woman in the front row. Karen's face had settled into a mask of cold determination as she prepared to cross a line that would change everything about her London vacation, and possibly her entire life. The ceremony continued around Karen as she worked the gum in her mouth, her eyes fixed on the young guard with growing resentment. In her twisted logic, he had become the symbol of everything that had gone wrong with her day, her vacation, and perhaps her entire life. The fact that he was simply doing his job with professional dignity somehow made her even angrier. "Gerald, look at him," she whispered venomously, standing there like he owns the place, like he's better than us. Gerald shifted uncomfortably, sensing the dangerous turn in his wife's mood. He had learned to recognize the signs over their years together, the way her jaw tightened, how her breathing became shallow and quick, the particular gleam that entered her eyes when she was about to do something spectacularly inappropriate. "Honey, maybe we should head back to the hotel," he suggested desperately. "We could grab some lunch, do some shopping." But Karen wasn't listening. She was completely focused on the guard, who remained perfectly still despite the growing crowd around him. His name was James Morrison, though Karen would never know this. He was 24 years old, had served 3 tours of duty, and took immense pride in his role as a Queen's Guard. He had withstood far worse than an angry tourist's stare, though he had no idea what was coming. As the minutes ticked by, Karen's internal monologue grew more hostile. She convinced herself that the guard was somehow mocking her, that his stoic expression was actually a smirk directed at her personally. She imagined he was judging her appearance, her nationality, her right to be there. The gum in her mouth had reached the perfect consistency, sticky but moldable, large enough to make an impact. Karen glanced around to make sure no security cameras were pointed directly at her, though she was far too angry to really care about consequences. "You know what?" she announced to Gerald, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "I'm going to show this pompous guard what I think of his little performance." Before Gerald could react, before anyone could stop her, Karen Mitchell did something that would be replayed on social media millions of times over the coming weeks. She pulled the chewed gum from her mouth, aimed carefully at the young guard's face, and launched it with surprising accuracy directly at his left eye. The pink wad of gum struck James Morrison squarely in the face, sticking to his eyelid and the bridge of his nose. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The crowd around Karen gasped in collective shock. Gerald's face went pale as he realized the magnitude of what his wife had just done. But James Morrison didn't flinch. He didn't break character. He didn't even blink with his unaffected eye. The gum clung to his face like a badge of shame that belonged entirely to Karen, yet he maintained his military bearing as if nothing had happened. This wasn't the reaction Karen had expected. She had wanted to provoke him, to make him break his composure and prove that he was just an ordinary person like everyone else. Instead, his complete lack of reaction only highlighted her own loss of control. "Did you see that?" She called out to the crowd as if expecting support for her actions. "I got him right in the eye. Not so tough now, is he?" But the crowd's reaction was not what Karen had anticipated. Instead of laughter or approval, she was met with horrified stares and disapproving murmurs. Tourists began pulling out their phones not to record the ceremony, but to capture footage of the woman who had just assaulted a Queen's Guard. An elderly British woman near Karen spoke up with quiet fury. "How dare you? That young man is serving his country with honor, and you should be ashamed of yourself." A father holding his young daughter moved away from Karen, whispering to his wife, "I can't believe someone would do such a thing. What kind of person attacks a soldier who can't defend himself?" Gerald tried to blend into the crowd, wishing desperately that he could disappear entirely. "Karen," he hissed urgently, "we need to leave. Now." But Karen was still riding the wave of her misplaced triumph. "He deserved it," she declared defiantly, standing there acting all superior. "I showed him who's boss." What Karen didn't realize was that her actions had been witnessed by more than just tourists. Palace security had been alerted within seconds of the incident. Plainclothes officers were already moving through the crowd, identifying her location and preparing to respond. The guard himself, James Morrison, remained motionless despite the gum still clinging to his face. His training had prepared him for many things: hostile crowds, weather extremes, physical exhaustion, but few scenarios had covered being attacked with chewing gum by an entitled tourist. Still, he maintained his post with the same dignity he would have shown facing any other challenge. Karen basked in what she perceived as victory, completely oblivious to the storm of consequences that was already building around her. She had no idea that her moment of spite had been recorded by dozens of phones, that videos of her attack were already being uploaded to social media platforms around the world. She also had no idea that James Morrison was not just any guard. He was a decorated veteran who had earned his position through years of exemplary service. He had survived combat zones and had dedicated his life to serving his country. The gum on his face was not a sign of his weakness, but rather a testament to Karen's complete lack of character. As the ceremony continued around them, Karen remained blissfully unaware that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had attacked not just a person, but a symbol of everything that decent people respected. And unlike her previous outbursts in restaurants and hotels, this time there would be no manager willing to accommodate her demands or offer free meals to make her go away. The wheels of justice were already beginning to turn, and Karen Mitchell was about to discover that some actions have consequences far beyond what she could have ever imagined. Within minutes of Karen's assault on the guard, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had shifted dramatically. What had been a peaceful tourist gathering was now buzzing with tension and outrage. Visitors who had witnessed the incident were talking among themselves in hushed, angry tones while others held up their phones, capturing every moment of the aftermath. Karen seemed completely oblivious to the change in mood. She stood with her arms crossed, wearing a satisfied smirk as she watched the guard continue his duties with the gum still stuck to his face. In her mind, she had won some kind of victory over the establishment, proved that these supposedly untouchable figures were just as vulnerable as anyone else. "See, Gerald?" she said triumphantly. "I told you he wasn't so special. Look at him now. Can't even clean his own face." Gerald was frantically tugging at his wife's arm, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing panic. He could see the security officers moving through the crowd, their eyes scanning faces and clearly searching for someone specific. "Karen, we have to go," he whispered urgently. "Right now, please." But Karen was enjoying her moment too much to listen. She had become the center of attention, which had always been her favorite place to be, even when that attention was negative. She didn't seem to notice that the crowd around her was no longer looking at the ceremony. They were looking at her, and their expressions ranged from disgust to complete bewilderment. A young woman with a British accent spoke up boldly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "That was absolutely disgraceful. You should be arrested for what you just did." Karen whirled around to face her critic, her defensive instincts kicking in immediately. "Mind your own business," she snapped. "I have every right to express my opinion. Expressing your opinion doesn't include assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Guard." The woman shot back, her phone still recording. "What you did was criminal." Other voices began joining in, creating a chorus of condemnation that should have been Karen's first real clue that she had crossed a serious line. An elderly gentleman with a military bearing stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "That young man is a professional soldier," he said clearly. "He's served his country with honor, and you've just humiliated him in front of hundreds of people. You should be thoroughly ashamed of yourself." Karen's response was predictably defensive and self-righteous. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "It's just a little gum. He'll be fine. Maybe next time he won't act so high and mighty." What Karen didn't realize was that her words were being recorded along with her image. Every defensive comment, every attempt to justify her actions, every display of her complete lack of remorse was being captured for posterity. The videos would soon be shared across social media platforms with captions like, "American tourist attacks British guard," and "the most entitled person you'll ever see." Meanwhile, James Morrison continued his duty with remarkable composure. The gum remained stuck to his face, a pink, humiliating reminder of Karen's cruelty, but he didn't move a muscle to remove it. His training had taught him that maintaining position and composure was more important than personal comfort or dignity. He would not break protocol even under these circumstances. The irony was lost on Karen, but it wasn't lost on the crowd. Here was a young man who had been publicly humiliated, yet he continued to conduct himself with more grace and professionalism than the woman who had attacked him could ever hope to demonstrate. The contrast was stark and powerful, and it made Karen look even worse by comparison. Security officers finally reached Karen's position in the crowd. They were dressed plainly, but their purpose was unmistakable as they approached her with calm authority. "Ma'am," one of them said politely but firmly, "we need to speak with you about an incident that just occurred." For the first time since launching the gum, Karen felt a flutter of genuine concern. But her instinctive response was to deny and deflect rather than take responsibility. "What incident?" she asked innocently, as if she hadn't just committed assault in front of hundreds of witnesses. "I'm just here watching the ceremony like everyone else." The security officer's expression remained professional but stern. "Ma'am, we have multiple witnesses who saw you throw an object at one of the guards. We're going to need you to come with us." Gerald stepped forward, his voice shaking with embarrassment and desperation. "Officers, I'm so sorry about this. My wife didn't mean any harm. She's having a difficult day." But Karen wasn't about to let her husband speak for her. "I don't have to go anywhere," she declared loudly. "This is harassment. I'm an American citizen and I know my rights." The crowd around them watched this exchange with fascination and growing satisfaction. Finally, they were seeing consequences for Karen's outrageous behavior. Justice was beginning to unfold before their eyes, and many of them continued recording, knowing they were witnessing something that would soon become viral content. One of the security officers spoke into his radio, calling for backup and describing the situation. Karen could hear words like assault on palace, grounds, and uncooperative subject, but she still didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of her situation. "This is ridiculous," she announced to anyone who would listen. "All this fuss over a piece of gum? You people need to get a sense of humor." But as more security personnel arrived and the circle around her began to tighten, Karen finally began to realize that her London vacation was about to take a very different turn than she had planned. The guard she had attacked continued to stand at his post, the pink gum still clinging to his face like evidence of her shame, while she was about to discover that actions truly do have consequences, especially when those actions are committed against symbols of national pride and honor. The situation escalated quickly as more palace security arrived on the scene. Karen found herself surrounded by officers, their presence making it clear that this was no longer a simple tourist incident that could be brushed aside with an apology and a warning. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion, and dozens of phones continued recording every moment of Karen's downfall. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us immediately," the lead security officer repeated, his tone growing more authoritative. "You've committed an assault on palace grounds against a member of the Queen's Guard." Karen's bravado was beginning to crack, but her pride wouldn't let her back down gracefully. "This is absolutely insane," she protested loudly. "It was just a piece of gum. You're treating me like I threw a bomb or something. The nature of the projectile doesn't change the fact that you assaulted a serving soldier," another officer explained patiently. "You'll need to come with us for questioning." Gerald stepped closer to his wife, his face pale with worry and embarrassment. He had spent years watching Karen's behavior escalate in restaurants, stores, and hotels. But this was different. This was serious. "Karen, please," he begged quietly. "Just cooperate. We'll call a lawyer. We'll sort this out." But Karen was still operating under the delusion that her American citizenship somehow made her immune to British law. "I want to speak to someone from the American embassy," she demanded. "You can't just arrest American tourists for no reason." "We're not arresting you without reason, ma'am," the officer replied calmly. "Multiple witnesses saw you assault Guard Morrison. This is a serious matter." For the first time, Karen learned the name of the man she had attacked. Guard Morrison. James Morrison. A real person with a name, a life, a family who would soon see videos of their son being humiliated by an entitled American tourist. But even this humanizing detail didn't seem to penetrate Karen's wall of self-righteous indignation. The crowd watched with growing satisfaction as Karen was slowly but surely being held accountable for her actions. Many of them had witnessed her behavior leading up to the assault, her complaints about the crowd, her rude comments about the guards, her general attitude of superiority. Now they were seeing justice unfold in real time. A middle-aged British man called out from the crowd, "Good on you, officers. About time someone like her faced consequences." This show of support from the public seemed to embolden the security team. They knew they were doing the right thing, protecting not just the individual guard but the institution he represented. James Morrison himself remained at his post throughout the entire confrontation. The gum was still stuck to his face, but he showed no signs of discomfort or anger. His professionalism was a stark contrast to Karen's increasingly hysterical behavior, and the comparison was not lost on anyone present. "Look at him," an elderly woman whispered to her companion, gesturing toward the guard, "still doing his duty despite what she did to him. That's what real character looks like." Karen overheard this comment and it seemed to inflame her even further. "Character?" she shouted. "He's just standing there like an idiot. Anyone could do that job." This outburst proved to be Karen's biggest mistake yet. Insulting the guard in front of a crowd of British citizens who held the Queen's Guard in high esteem was like pouring gasoline on a fire. The murmur of disapproval from the crowd grew louder and more hostile. "That's enough," the lead security officer said firmly. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault. You'll need to come with us now." The words "under arrest" seemed to finally penetrate Karen's cloud of denial. For the first time since launching the gum, she looked genuinely frightened. "You can't arrest me," she stammered. "I'm on vacation. I have a flight to catch tomorrow." "You should have thought about that before you assaulted a guard," the officer replied without sympathy. Gerald tried one last time to intervene. "Officers, please, is there any way we can resolve this without arrest? My wife will apologize. She'll pay a fine. Anything." But it was too late for apologies or fines. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had committed a crime in front of hundreds of witnesses, showed no remorse, continued to insult the victim, and demonstrated a complete lack of understanding about the seriousness of her actions. As handcuffs were produced, Karen's composure finally cracked completely. "This is harassment," she screamed. "I'm being persecuted for being American. This is discrimination." The crowd watched with fascination as Karen was officially placed under arrest. Her cries of persecution fell on deaf ears. Everyone present had witnessed her unprovoked attack on the guard, and her nationality had nothing to do with the consequences she was now facing. The officers began to lead Karen away from the ceremony area, and it was only then that something truly unexpected happened. James Morrison, who had remained perfectly still throughout the entire incident, finally moved. But instead of wiping the gum from his face or showing any sign of relief that his tormentor was being removed, he did something that surprised everyone present. He turned his head slightly and nodded once, a small, respectful acknowledgement toward the officers who were handling the situation. It was a gesture of gratitude and professionalism that spoke volumes about his character. Even after being publicly humiliated, he maintained his dignity and showed respect for the law enforcement officers doing their job. This simple, graceful gesture was captured on dozens of phones and would later become one of the most shared moments of the entire incident. It perfectly encapsulated the difference between James Morrison, a professional soldier who maintained his composure and dignity under attack, and Karen Mitchell, a woman whose sense of entitlement had led her to commit a shameful act against someone who couldn't defend himself. As Karen was led away, still protesting her innocence and claiming persecution, the crowd began to disperse, but the ceremony continued and James Morrison returned to his stoic vigil. The gum finally removed by a superior officer who had witnessed the entire incident with quiet pride in his subordinate's conduct. The police station was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Karen sat in a small sterile interview room, her designer clothes now wrinkled from the arrest process, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, and her makeup smudged from the tears of frustration and disbelief that had finally come. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. Though she was still fighting to maintain her sense of righteous indignation, Detective Inspector Sarah Collins sat across from her, reviewing the file that had grown surprisingly thick in just a few hours. The incident at the palace had generated an enormous amount of evidence: witness statements, video footage from multiple angles, social media posts that were already going viral, and background information about both Karen and the guard she had attacked. "Mrs. Mitchell," Detective Inspector Collins began, her voice professional but not unsympathetic, "I need to go over what happened at Buckingham Palace this afternoon." Multiple witnesses have stated that you deliberately threw chewing gum at guard Morrison, striking him in the face. Is this accurate? Karen's first instinct was still to deny and deflect. It was hardly an assault, she protested. It was just a small piece of gum. Nobody was hurt. Mrs. Mitchell, assault is defined as the intentional application of unlawful force to another person. The size or nature of the object is irrelevant. You deliberately threw something at a person who was unable to defend himself due to his professional duties. For the first time since the incident began, Karen seemed to grasp that this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple explanation or an insincere apology. But he was just standing there acting so superior, she said, her voice smaller now. He was making me feel uncomfortable. Detective Inspector Collins made a note. Can you explain how Guard Morrison made you feel uncomfortable? Did he speak to you? Make gestures? Threaten you in any way? Karen struggled to find an answer that would make sense to anyone but herself. He was just standing there looking down on everyone, looking down on me. Mrs. Mitchell, Guard Morrison was performing his ceremonial duties. He wasn't looking at you specifically, and he certainly wasn't threatening you. You attacked an innocent man who was simply doing his job. The weight of this statement seemed to hit Karen for the first time. She had been so caught up in her own feelings of persecution and entitlement that she hadn't truly considered James Morrison as a real person with feelings, dignity, and rights of his own. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading far beyond the confines of the police station. The videos captured by tourists were being shared across social media platforms at an exponential rate. A Karen attacks guard was trending on Twitter, and the footage was being picked up by news outlets around the world. Gerald had been allowed to make phone calls, and he was frantically trying to reach their lawyer back in Ohio, their travel insurance company, and the American embassy. But each conversation brought more bad news. Their lawyer couldn't practice in the UK. Their travel insurance didn't cover criminal acts. And the embassy, while offering basic consular services, made it clear that American citizenship didn't provide immunity from British law. Back in the interview room, Detective Inspector Collins was explaining the charges Karen would be facing. You're being charged with common assault, which carries a potential sentence of up to 6 months in prison and a fine of up to £5,000. Additionally, because this occurred on royal property and involved a member of the Queen's Guard, there may be additional charges related to threatening behavior on protected premises. Karen's face went white. Prison? She whispered. But I'm supposed to fly home tomorrow. This is our anniversary trip. Mrs. Mitchell, you'll be appearing before a magistrate in the morning. Until then, you'll remain in custody. Your husband has been informed and arrangements are being made for legal representation. As the reality of spending the night in jail sank in, Karen finally began to show something resembling genuine remorse. But even then, it seemed to be more about her own situation than any real understanding of what she had done to James Morrison. Can I apologize to him? She asked quietly. To the guard? Detective Inspector Collins studied her for a moment. Guard Morrison has declined to make a victim impact statement at this time. He's requested to handle this matter through official channels only. What Karen didn't know was that James Morrison's response to her arrest had been characteristically gracious and professional. When asked if he wanted to press for maximum charges, he had simply stated that he wanted the law to take its course fairly, without vindictiveness or personal animosity. The story of Karen's attack and arrest was now making headlines around the world. News outlets were describing it as an example of entitled tourism and American arrogance abroad. The contrast between her behavior and James Morrison's dignified response was being held up as a study in character and professionalism. Social media users were not kind in their assessment of Karen's actions. Comments ranged from mockery to genuine anger, with many people expressing admiration for the guard's composure and contempt for Karen's behavior. Some users had even identified her from the videos and were sharing details about her life back in Ohio, though this vigilante behavior was quickly discouraged by the platforms. James Morrison himself had returned to his duties after giving his statement to police. His commanding officers had offered him leave to deal with the incident, but he had declined, preferring to maintain his normal routine. The gum attack had not shaken his dedication to his role, though he privately admitted to colleagues that it had been one of the more unusual challenges of his military career. In her cell that night, Karen lay awake on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling and finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had done. The comfortable bubble of entitlement that had protected her for so many years had finally burst, and she was facing the consequences of her actions in the harsh light of reality. She thought about James Morrison, really thought about him as a person for the first time. He was probably not much older than her own son back home. He had been doing his job with pride and professionalism, and she had humiliated him in front of hundreds of people for no reason other than her own petty frustrations. For the first time since the incident began, Karen felt something that might have been genuine shame. The magistrate's court was packed with reporters and curious onlookers when Karen appeared for her hearing the next morning. Word of the gum attack guard incident had spread internationally overnight, turning what should have been a routine assault case into a media spectacle. Karen, wearing the same clothes from the previous day and looking haggard after her night in custody, seemed overwhelmed by the attention. Her court-appointed solicitor, David Hughes, was experienced in handling cases involving tourists who had found themselves in legal trouble abroad. But even he admitted privately that Karen's case was particularly challenging, given the overwhelming evidence and her complete lack of remorse during the initial incident. "Mrs. Mitchell," Magistrate Eleanor Webb began, "you are charged with common assault against Guard James Morrison of Her Majesty's Guard, and with threatening behavior on protected premises. How do you plead?" Karen looked to her solicitor, who had advised her that fighting the charges would be futile given the video evidence and numerous witnesses. "Guilty, Your Honor," she said quietly, the words seeming to stick in her throat. The prosecutor presented the case efficiently, playing several videos of the incident that had been provided by witnesses. Watching herself on the courtroom screen, Karen seemed to see her behavior from an outside perspective for the first time. The woman in the videos looked entitled, cruel, and completely out of control. She could barely recognize herself in that person. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "this was an unprovoked attack on a serving member of the armed forces, who was unable to defend himself due to his professional duties. The defendant showed no remorse at the scene and continued to insult Guard Morrison even after her arrest. When it came time for the defense, David Hughes did his best to present mitigating factors. Your Honor, my client is deeply remorseful for her actions. She was under stress from travel fatigue and personal circumstances. She has no prior criminal record and is a respected member of her community in Ohio." But the magistrate had seen the videos, read the witness statements, and noted Karen's behavior during and after the arrest. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said directly, "I've reviewed the evidence in this case, and I must say that your conduct was not only criminal but deeply shameful. You attacked a young man who has dedicated his life to serving his country, and you did so simply because his presence somehow offended you." Karen felt her face burn with shame as the magistrate continued. "Guard Morrison has shown remarkable professionalism throughout this entire incident. He maintained his composure during your attack, cooperated fully with the investigation, and has specifically requested that this court focus on justice rather than revenge. His character stands in stark contrast to the behavior you displayed." The sentence was swift and decisive. Karen was fined £2,000, ordered to pay additional court costs, and given a suspended sentence of 2 months' imprisonment, meaning she would go to jail if she committed any further offenses within the next year. Additionally, she was banned from entering any royal properties for 5 years and required to perform 100 hours of community service upon her return to the United States. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of Karen's punishment. As she left the courthouse, she was met by a crowd of reporters shouting questions and photographers capturing her every move. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you have any message for Guard Morrison?" one reporter called out. "How do you feel about becoming an international symbol of entitled behavior?" shouted another. Karen pulled her jacket over her head and hurried toward the waiting taxi, but there was no escaping the media attention. The videos of her attack had been viewed millions of times across various platforms, and news outlets from around the world were covering the story as an example of tourist behavior gone wrong. The flight home to Ohio was a nightmare of recognition and whispered comments. Fellow passengers had seen the news coverage, and Karen found herself the subject of stares, pointed fingers, and barely concealed contempt. Gerald sat beside her in miserable silence, their anniversary trip having turned into the most humiliating experience of their lives. but the real consequences were waiting for them back home. Karen's employer, a prestigious law firm where she worked as a paralegal, had terminated her employment while she was still in London. The managing partners cited conduct incompatible with the firm's values and reputation in their dismissal letter. Social media had been particularly brutal. The hashtag #KarenAttacksGuard had generated thousands of posts, memes, and commentary pieces about entitled behavior and privilege. Karen's LinkedIn profile had been flooded with negative comments before she finally deleted it entirely. Her Facebook account, which had once been filled with photos of vacation trips and social gatherings, became a target for strangers expressing their disgust with her actions. The local news station in Ohio picked up the story, interviewing neighbors and former colleagues about Karen's character. The picture that emerged was of someone who had always been difficult and demanding, but whose behavior had now crossed into criminal territory. She was always complaining about something. One former coworker told the reporter anonymously, "The coffee was too hot, the air conditioning was too cold, the parking spots weren't close enough. But I never thought she would do something like this." Karen's own family struggled to understand what had happened. Her sister refused to take her phone calls, embarrassed by the association. Her elderly mother, confused by the media attention, asked repeatedly why Karen would do such a thing to that nice young soldier. Meanwhile, James Morrison had become something of a folk hero. His dignified response to Karen's attack, his continued professionalism, and his gracious handling of the aftermath had earned him widespread admiration. The British public, already fond of their Queen's Guards, saw him as a perfect example of the values they hoped their military represented. The Queen herself had been briefed on the incident, and while she made no public comment, it was reported that she had personally commended Morrison for his conduct. The story of his composure under attack became part of the regiment's informal history, passed down as an example of how to maintain dignity in the face of civilian hostility. For Karen, the most difficult part was learning about James Morrison's background. News reports revealed that he had served multiple tours in Afghanistan, had been decorated for bravery under fire, and had specifically requested assignment to the Queen's Guard as a way to continue serving his country in a ceremonial capacity that honored military tradition. The young man she had attacked wasn't just some guard standing there looking superior. He was a war veteran who had risked his life for his country and had dedicated himself to a role that required perfect discipline and self-control. Her petty attack on him had been an assault not just on an individual, but on the very qualities of service and sacrifice that he represented. 6 months after the incident, Karen was working at a grocery store, the only job she could find after her conviction. The community service hours were completed at a veterans support center, where she learned more about the challenges faced by returning soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now serving the very community she had once shown such contempt for. Gerald had stayed with her, but their marriage was strained by the financial and social consequences of her actions. They had lost friends, faced financial hardship from legal fees and her job loss, and continued to deal with occasional recognition from strangers who remembered the viral videos. Karen often found herself thinking about those few seconds at Buckingham Palace when she had made the decision that changed everything. She couldn't take back the gum she had thrown, couldn't undo the humiliation she had caused James Morrison, and couldn't escape the fact that her moment of entitled rage had defined her in the eyes of the world. The most painful realization was that James Morrison had never done anything to deserve her attack. He had simply been doing his job with honor and professionalism, while she had allowed her own frustrations and sense of entitlement to turn her into exactly the kind of person she had once looked down upon. In quiet moments, Karen sometimes wondered if James Morrison ever thought about that day, whether the memory of her attack still bothered him, or if he had moved on with the same dignity he had shown during the incident itself. She hoped it was the latter, though she knew she would never have the chance to find out. The gum she had thrown in anger had stuck to more than just his face. It had stuck to her reputation, her career, her relationships, and her sense of self. And unlike the gum that had been quickly removed from the guard's face, the consequences of her actions would follow Karen Mitchell for the rest of her life. A permanent reminder that actions have consequences, and that treating others with cruelty and disrespect ultimately reflects more on the attacker than on the victim. James Morrison, meanwhile, continued his duties with the same quiet professionalism that had made him a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is simply to maintain one's honor and let justice take its course.